Story number 1. The Silent Neighbor. I moved into 6B of the Langridge Arms on a gray October morning. The building had the kind of charm only old New England architecture could muster: high ceilings, creaky hardwood floors, and a faint scent of damp wood that lingered no matter how much you aired it out. The landlord, Mr. Fenton, was a wiry man with a nervous energy, the type who smiled too much but never quite made eye contact. "It's a good building," he assured me as we climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. "Quiet. Tenants keep to themselves. You'll love it here." When we reached my floor, Mr. Fenton gestured to the door across from mine. "That's 6A. Just you and the neighbor on this floor. Friendly?" I asked, already imagining awkward hallway encounters. Mr. Fenton hesitated, his smile faltering for the first time. "You'll probably never see them. They're quiet." I didn't think much about the neighbor for the first week. I was busy unpacking and adjusting to the quirks of the apartment: radiators that clanged like a blacksmith's forge, windows that rattled in the slightest breeze. But then came the noises. It started with the whispering. Faint, barely audible, like someone muttering just on the other side of the wall. I thought it was the neighbor at first, maybe talking on the phone late at night. But as the days passed, it grew stranger. The whispers didn't sound like one person, they sounded like many. And they weren't speaking English, or at least not any language I recognized. Then came the tapping. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate, like someone lightly drumming their fingers against the shared wall. It always came late at night, when the rest of the building was silent. I told myself it was nothing, pipes expanding, the building settling, but deep down, I knew better. A few nights later, I decided to introduce myself to the neighbor. It seemed ridiculous that I hadn't at least said hello. I knocked on the door of 6A. The sound echoed down the empty hallway. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. As I turned to leave, I noticed something odd. The door was open. Not wide open, but just enough to see the dark sliver of the apartment beyond. "Hello?" I called, pushing the door open a little further. The apartment was empty. Not just empty of people, but empty of everything. No furniture, no decorations, nothing to suggest someone actually lived there. The air was cold, colder than it had any right to be, and the silence was oppressive, like the apartment was holding its breath. I backed away, pulling the door shut behind me, and hurried back to 6B. The next morning, I asked Mr. Fenton about 6A. "There's no one in that apartment," he said, his tone matter of fact. "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "It's vacant. Has been for years." I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh or admit it was a joke, but he just shrugged and walked away. That night, the whispers returned, louder than ever. They seemed to swirl around the room, rising and falling like waves crashing against the shore. I sat in bed, clutching the sheets, my heart pounding. And then I heard the knock. 3 soft raps on my door. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It came again, louder this time. I forced myself to get up, my legs trembling as I approached the door. When I opened it, the hallway was empty. But the door to 6A was ajar, the darkness beyond beckoning like an open grave. The next few days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and mounting dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight. The noises grew worse. The whispers turned into moans, guttural and desperate, and the tapping became a constant, maddening rhythm. And always, the door to 6A was open. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into 6A. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing bare walls and a floor covered in dust. But as I ventured deeper, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The far wall was covered in writing, scrawled in a dark, sticky substance. The words overlapped and twisted, forming a chaotic, nonsensical pattern. In the center of it all was a single message, written in bold, jagged letters: "Join US." I ran back to my apartment, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands shook as I dialed Mr. Fenton's number. "There's something wrong with this building," I said, my voice trembling. "That apartment, 6A, it's not empty." It can't be. He sighed on the other end of the line. You weren't supposed to go in there. What are you talking about? There's a reason we keep it empty, he said. The last tenant, he didn't leave. Not really. What do you mean? He's still there, Fenton said quietly. And he's always looking for someone new. That night, the knocking came again. Louder this time, more insistent. I stayed in bed, clutching the blankets, my eyes squeezed shut. But it didn't stop. When I finally opened my eyes, I saw it, a shadow standing at the foot of my bed. It was tall, featureless, and impossibly dark, its presence filling the room like a suffocating fog. You shouldn't have come here, it said, its voice a hollow whisper that echoed in my skull. And then everything went black. I woke up in 6A. The room was empty except for me, the door shut tight. The walls were bare, the writing gone, but the air still carried that oppressive chill. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. The whispers started again, louder and more frantic than ever. They filled my head, drowning out my thoughts, until I finally understood what they were saying. You're the new one now. If you ever find yourself at the Langridge Arms, avoid 6A. Don't knock, don't look inside, and for the love of God, don't move in. Because once you do, you'll never leave. Story number 2. The Faceless Landlord. When we first found the listing for the apartment on Elbridge Street, it felt too good to be true. A spacious 2-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place we could never afford on our combined salaries. The rent was suspiciously low, but the landlord's only condition was clear in the email: no questions about me, the building, or its history. Follow the rules, and you'll have no problems. Lena and I were desperate. We'd been scraping by in a cramped studio that barely had room for a bed, much less our growing collection of books, knickknacks, and life's accumulated clutter. The lease terms were strange, sure, but the place looked clean, and the landlord responded promptly to our questions about the utilities and parking. We rationalized that maybe they were just eccentric, someone who didn't want to deal with renters poking into their business. We signed the lease electronically and moved in a week later. At first, it was perfect. The apartment was airy, with high ceilings and polished wood floors that gleamed in the sunlight. The kitchen was small but functional, and the living room had a view of a quiet street lined with oak trees. The only odd detail was the landlord's welcome email, which arrived the night we moved in. It wasn't a warm greeting or a rundown of local hotspots. Instead, it was a list of rules. 1.do not open the windows after 10 p.m. 2.do not enter the basement for any reason. 3. If you hear knocking at the front door between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m., do not answer it. 4. Never ask questions about the landlord. Lena laughed it off. Creepy, sure, but maybe they're just paranoid. Some people have weird superstitions. I nodded, uneasy but unwilling to let my discomfort ruin our new home. As long as the rent stays this cheap, I'll follow whatever rules they want. The first few weeks passed without incident. The apartment was quiet, and the rules were easy to follow. We never stayed up late enough to worry about the windows, the basement door was locked, and no one knocked on our door in the middle of the night. Lena joked about how lucky we were to find a place like this, and I tried to ignore the occasional twinge of unease that crept in when I thought about the landlord's demands. That changed one night in late November. It started with the email. At exactly 9:30 p.m., I got a message from the landlord. The subject line read, "New rule." My stomach sank as I opened it. The body of the email was short and blunt. Rule 5, do not turn on the bathroom light after midnight. Did you see this? I asked Lena, showing her the email. She frowned. What the hell? That's weird. How would they even know? We both looked around, half expecting to find hidden cameras or some other invasive monitoring system, but we found nothing unusual. Maybe it's just one of those old buildings where the wiring's sketchy, Lena said. If we turn it on, the whole circuit might blow. Her explanation made sense, but the timing of the email still unnerved me. We decided to ignore it and go to bed. At 12:17 a.m., I woke to the sound of dripping water. I sat up, groggy and disoriented, and realized it was coming from the bathroom. The door was ajar, and in the darkness, I could see the faint gleam of water pooling on the tiles. "Lena?" I whispered, nudging her. She stirred but didn't wake. Against my better judgment, I got out of bed and crept toward the bathroom. The dripping grew louder with each step, a steady rhythm that echoed in the silent apartment. When I pushed the door open, the light flickered on by itself. The sink was full of water, dark and murky, with a smell that made me gag. And there, staring back at me from the surface of the water, was a reflection that wasn't my own. It had no face. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut. My heart was pounding as I crawled back into bed, too scared to wake Lena, too scared to close my eyes. The next morning, the bathroom was pristine, as if nothing had happened. I wanted to move out, but Lena convinced me to stay. "It's just stress," she said. "We're adjusting to a new place. Old buildings make noises. Pipes leak. It's nothing." She didn't believe me about the faceless reflection, but I knew what I'd seen. The landlord's rules became more frequent after that. Emails arrived almost daily, each one more unsettling than the last. Rule 6: Do not place mirrors in the bedroom. Rule 7: If you hear scratching at the walls, do not investigate. Rule 8: Never leave the apartment between 3 o'clock and 4 a.m. Lena dismissed them as paranoia, but I started to feel trapped, like the walls were closing in. One night, while Lena was working late, I decided to break the rules. Not out of defiance, but out of desperation. I wanted to know what we were dealing with. I opened the window at 10:15 p.m. At first, nothing happened. The cool night air rushed in, and I felt a small thrill of triumph. But then I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like someone exhaling right behind me. I turned, and there it was. The figure stood in the corner of the living room, its body cloaked in shadows, its face, or lack of one, tilted toward me. It was tall, impossibly so, with limbs that seemed too long and a presence that radiated malice. The window slammed shut on its own, and the figure vanished. I told Lena everything, but she didn't believe me. "Maybe we should just break the lease," I begged. "We can find another place, somewhere normal." "We can't afford anywhere else," she said. "We're just spooking ourselves. It's all in your head." But it wasn't. The next night, we broke another rule. Lena wanted to see the basement, convinced it was just storage space and nothing more. The door was unlocked, the old wood creaking as it swung open. The stairs led down into darkness, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, we found nothing but an empty room, the concrete wall slick with condensation. And then the door slammed shut behind us. We heard it then, the whispers. They came from everywhere and nowhere, a chorus of voices that rose and fell like the tide. "Leave," they said. "Leave now." The door opened on its own, and we ran, stumbling up the stairs and slamming it shut behind us. The final email arrived 2 days later. Rule 9: You have broken too many rules. You cannot leave. That night, I woke to the sound of scratching at the bedroom door. Lena was gone. I called her name, but there was no answer. When I opened the door, the faceless landlord was waiting for me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. If you ever find a rental listing with rules that don't make sense, don't sign the lease. No matter how cheap the rent is, no matter how desperate you are, walk away. Because once you move in, you'll never move out. Story number 3. Room 14. I'd been the maintenance guy at the Bellwether Arms for 3 years when I first heard about Room 14. The building was one of those old pre-war structures you find scattered across the city, elegant from the outside, but a maze of creaky floors, leaky pipes, and wiring held together with duct tape and prayer. I'd seen my share of strange things working there, but nothing prepared me for that room. The Bellwether had 13 apartments, each with a brass number plaque nailed to the door. 12 on the main floors and 1 at the very top, a spacious penthouse suite that hadn't been rented in years. But there was no Room 14. No one spoke of it. The building's design made no sense. There was a gap between units where a 14th apartment should have been. I once asked the building manager, Mrs. Harper, about it, and she just waved me off. "Forget about it," she said, her voice clipped and her eyes darting toward the hallway like she was afraid someone might hear. We don't talk about that room. That was enough for me at first. But over time, the stories began to pile up. Tenants whispered about strange noises, muffled voices, faint knocking, sometimes even the sound of heavy furniture being dragged across the floor. All from a room that didn't exist. I heard rumors about residents disappearing, their apartments quickly rented out to new tenants as if nothing had happened. Each time, room 14 was mentioned, but never directly. Just enough to plant the seed of curiosity in my mind. It wasn't until last October that I decided to investigate for myself. The week leading up to Halloween was unusually quiet in the building. Too quiet. Tenants who normally complained about every dripping faucet or creaky step suddenly avoided me, their smiles thin and strained. Even Mrs. Harper, who normally patrolled the lobby like a hawk, seemed jumpy. On the 30th of October, I was fixing a radiator in 8B when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic knocking coming from behind the wall. It was faint but insistent, like someone tapping a single knuckle against wood. I followed the sound into the hallway, where it grew louder. It seemed to be coming from the dead space between apartments. I found myself standing in front of a blank section of wall. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence. My pulse quickened as I reached out and pressed my hand against the plaster. It felt colder than it should have been, the chill seeping into my skin. Then I saw it, a faint outline of a door, almost imperceptible unless you knew where to look. Something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the months of whispered stories, the unanswered questions, or just my own damn curiosity. Whatever it was, I grabbed my toolbox and got to work. The plaster wasn't as thick as I'd expected. It crumbled away under my hammer, revealing an old, warped wooden door behind it. The brass plaque on the door read, 14. I hesitated, my breath fogging in the cold air that seeped out from the cracks around the frame. The air smelled wrong, like mildew and something metallic, like rust or blood. I should have stopped there, walked away, but I couldn't. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. It turned easily, and the door creaked open. The room beyond was pitch black, the kind of darkness that swallowed the weak beam of my flashlight. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. The air was thick, oppressive, and carried a faint, sickly sweet odor that made my stomach churn. My flashlight flickered, and I saw them, photographs. Hundreds of them, pinned to the walls in neat, orderly rows. They covered every inch of the room, black and white snapshots of people frozen in moments of time. There were couples smiling at each other, children playing in the park, elderly men and women sitting on benches. But the photos weren't just old, they were wrong. The faces were too sharp, the smiles too wide. It was like looking at mannequins pretending to be human. Then I saw myself. My photograph was in the center of the wall, larger than the others. I was standing in the hallway outside room 14, my toolbox in hand, my expression frozen in confusion. But what made my blood run cold was the red mark smeared across the photograph. It looked like blood, thick and congealed, forming an X over my face. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. That's when I noticed the silence. No creaking floors, no hum from the building's ancient boiler. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then the whispers began. They came from everywhere at once, rising and falling like the tide. The voices overlapped, some loud and insistent, others barely audible, but they all spoke the same words, "You're not supposed to be here." The door slammed shut behind me, and the flashlight went out completely. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, angrier, until they weren't whispers anymore. They were screams. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, its movements slow and deliberate. It was tall, its body shrouded in darkness, but its face, or the absence of one, was the most horrifying thing I'd ever seen. A blank canvas where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. It raised a hand, pointing directly at me. I don't remember how I got out. One moment I was trapped in that suffocating darkness, and the next I was in the hallway, gasping for air. The wall was intact, no sign of the door I'd uncovered. I staggered to my feet, my body trembling, and ran to Mrs. Harper's office. She didn't look surprised when I burst in, covered in dust and shaking like a leaf. She just sighed and handed me a manila envelope. Inside were more photographs, all taken in the same room I'd just escaped. Faces stared back at me, their expressions frozen in terror. "They always come back," she said quietly, her voice devoid of emotion. "Room 14 doesn't like to be ignored." I quit that night, but it didn't matter. The next morning, when I tried to call Lena, my girlfriend, she didn't pick up. When I went to see her, she didn't recognize me. My friends, my family, they all looked at me like I was a stranger. My name wasn't on the lease for my apartment anymore. My bank accounts were empty. It was as if I'd never existed. Now, I live on the fringes, avoiding the Bellwether Arms and its cursed room. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again. They follow me, growing louder, reminding me of what I saw. Reminding me that you can't leave room 14. Not really. If you ever find yourself at the Bellwether Arms, don't ask about the missing room. Don't listen to the whispers. And for the love of God, don't open the door. Story number 4. The missing floor. I moved into the Halcyon Tower on a rainy Tuesday, lured by promises of an affordable one-bedroom apartment in a city that was bleeding me dry. The building was old, a concrete giant from the 1960s with a certain brutal charm, if you squinted hard enough. My apartment was clean, spacious enough for one person, and came with a view of the river, even if the windows were so grimy it muted the sparkle. The first time I noticed something strange about the building was during my second week. The elevator had a personality of its own, sometimes skipping floors, sometimes making ominous groaning noises that left me gripping the handrail. But that day, as I pressed the button for my floor, 14, I noticed something odd. The panel flickered, and for a split second, a number appeared where there shouldn't have been one. A blank button, nestled between 12 and 14, lit up faintly with an eerie glow. It vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, and the elevator continued its sluggish ascent, stopping at 14 as if nothing had happened. I laughed it off, blaming the building's quirks. But deep down, a seed of unease had been planted. The second time it happened, I wasn't alone. A neighbor, a quiet woman with sharp eyes and an air of perpetual distraction, was in the elevator with me. We exchanged polite nods, and I pressed 14 while she pressed 12. The elevator creaked into motion, but instead of stopping at 12, it slowed somewhere in between. The air felt wrong, thicker somehow, heavier. The panel flickered again, and the blank button lit up, its ghostly glow casting strange shadows on the walls. "What the hell?" I murmured, glancing at my neighbor. Her face had gone pale, her eyes fixed on the button. She reached out instinctively, jabbing at 12 repeatedly. The elevator shuddered, the doors slid open, and we were met with a hallway I'd never seen before. It was dark, the flickering fluorescence above casting an anemic glow over cracked tiles and walls stained with something I didn't want to identify. The air was damp, carrying the faint smell of mildew and something metallic, like old blood. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with battered doors, their numbers faded or missing entirely. Neither of us moved. "Close the door," she whispered, her voice trembling. I reached for the panel, but before I could press anything, we heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere down the hallway. Tap, tap, tap. Like someone walking barefoot on wet tiles. The neighbor grabbed my arm. "Don't step out," she hissed. Her nails dug into my skin as the tapping grew louder, closer. The elevator doors closed suddenly, as if the building itself had intervened, and we were jolted back into motion. Neither of us spoke until the doors opened on 14, where she practically ran out without so much as a goodbye. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over in my mind. I told myself it was a fluke, a glitch in an aging building. But deep down, I knew better. The dream started a few days later. I was standing in that hallway, the air cold enough to make my breath fog. The doors loomed on either side of me, each one slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. And always, I heard the crying. Soft at first, a quiet whimper that grew louder with each step I took. It came from somewhere ahead, a desperate, keening wail that made my skin crawl. In the dream, I always stopped at one particular door. The number was scratched out, the wood splintered and warped, but something about it drew me in. My hand would reach for the knob, trembling, and just as I turned it, I'd wake up. My heart would be pounding, my sheets damp with sweat, the sound of the crying lingering in my ears. I avoided the elevator after that, opting for the stairs even when it meant climbing 14 flights. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the dreams continued, each one pulling me closer to that door. The turning point came on a Friday night. I was coming home late from work, too tired to take the stairs, and convinced myself the elevator was just a machine, incapable of malice. I stepped inside, hit 14, and leaned against the wall, my eyes half closed. The panel flickered. My stomach dropped as the blank button lit up, brighter than before. The elevator groaned, lurching to a stop. The doors slid open, and there it was, the hallway from my dreams. This time, I stepped out. The air was even colder than I remembered, each breath burning in my lungs. The tiles beneath my feet were slick, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting uneven shadows. The crying was louder now, echoing down the corridor, a heart-wrenching sound that made my chest ache. I walked forward, my steps hesitant. The doors on either side seemed to lean inward, as if they were watching me. The crying grew louder, more desperate, and I realized it was coming from the same door that haunted my dreams. The door was worse in real life. The wood was warped and rotting, the number completely scratched away. Deep grooves, like claw marks, ran down its surface. My hand shook as I reached for the knob. The crying stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard a voice. "Help me." It was my voice. I yanked the door open, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was me, sitting in a chair in the middle of the room, my wrists and ankles bound with frayed rope. My face was streaked with tears, my mouth gagged with a dirty cloth. My eyes, my own eyes, were wide with terror as I struggled against the restraints. "Help me," the other me screamed, muffled but unmistakable. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. But before I could move, the figure in the chair stopped struggling. Their head snapped up, and their eyes locked onto mine. They smiled. The lights in the hallway flickered wildly, and the air grew impossibly cold. The last thing I saw before the door slammed shut was the other me standing, their movements jerky and unnatural, their smile stretching too wide for any human face. The elevator doors were open when I turned, and I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, every lock bolted, every light turned on. The dream stopped after that, but things haven't gone back to normal. My reflection doesn't always move when I do. I hear faint crying when I'm alone, even in the middle of the day. And sometimes, when I take the elevator, it pauses for just a moment, long enough for the blank button to flicker faintly before the doors close again. I don't know what's waiting on that floor, but I know it's still watching me. Waiting for me to come back. If you ever find yourself in an old building with an elevator that doesn't quite make sense, take the stairs. No matter how tired you are, no matter how late it is. Because once you step onto the missing floor, it won't let you leave. Story number 5. The Blood Contract. The apartment listing looked too good to be true. A spacious one-bedroom in a charming old building, close to campus, and at a price that made me wonder if there had been a typo. After weeks of crashing on a friend's couch and trying to stretch my barista wages far enough to scrape together a deposit, I didn't hesitate. I called the number, met the landlord the same afternoon, and signed the lease in the dingy lobby of a coffee shop. I didn't read the fine print. Why would I? The landlord was a quiet, older man with thinning gray hair and an unsettling habit of licking his lips every few seconds. His eyes seemed to flicker whenever I met his gaze, but I chalked it up to bad lighting or my own exhaustion. He slid the lease across the table to me, the papers thin and yellowed, the edges curling like they'd been left in the sun too long. "It's a standard lease," he said, his voice raspy as though he'd been chain-smoking for decades. "Just sign at the bottom, initial here and here." I signed. The apartment itself was decent. It had creaky floors, outdated appliances, and smelled faintly of mothballs, but I'd lived in worse. The crown jewel of the space was a built-in bookshelf carved into one wall of the living room. It was empty except for a single item, a clay jar sitting dead center on the middle shelf. It was odd-looking, with cracked spiderwebbing its surface and faint red stains around the rim. The landlord had said nothing about it when he handed me the keys. When I tried to move it, it wouldn't budge, like it had been glued to the shelf. I laughed it off, thinking maybe it was some kind of quirky decoration. The first month passed without incident. I settled in, juggling my classes and late shifts at the cafe, and the apartment started to feel like home. But just before rent was due, things began to change. It started with the whispers. Late at night, when the building was silent, I'd hear them, soft voices coming from the direction of the bookshelf. At first, I thought it was my neighbors, maybe the thin walls carrying their conversations. But the whispers didn't sound like normal voices. They were layered, overlapping, like dozens of people speaking at once. And they weren't in English. I tried to ignore them, but then came the dreams. In the dreams, I was standing in front of the bookshelf, staring at the jar. Its cracks seemed deeper, pulsing faintly as if the thing were breathing. My hands were trembling, a knife in one, a small cup in the other. I'd press the blade to my palm, wincing as blood pooled into the cup, and then pour it into the jar. As the blood soaked into the clay, the whispers would turn into screams. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my palm aching as if I'd actually cut it. A week later, I noticed the clause in the lease. I'd been searching for a copy of my class schedule, buried somewhere in the mountain of papers on my desk, when I found the lease instead. Something about the yellowed pages made my stomach twist. I hadn't thought about the document since I signed it, but now, for some reason, I felt compelled to read it. At first, everything seemed normal. Rent due on the 1st of the month. No pets allowed. Tenants responsible for utility bills. Then, in a section labeled Special Terms, I saw it. Tenant must provide a monthly offering of blood to the vessel in the apartment. Failure to comply will result in punitive action. I stared at the words, my chest tightening. This had to be a joke, some bizarre legalese meant to scare renters into following the rules. But the more I read, the less I could deny it. That night, the whispers grew louder. I lay in bed, every light in the apartment on, staring at the ceiling as the voices ebbed and flowed. My chest felt heavy, the air too thick to breathe. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, grabbed my desk lamp, and marched to the bookshelf. The jar sat there, unassuming yet menacing, its cracked surface catching the light in strange ways. "What do you want?" I hissed, half expecting it to answer. It didn't, but the whispers stopped. Instead, the room filled with a deep, guttural sound, like something exhaling from inside the jar. The air turned cold, and I stumbled back, my lamp flickering before going dark. The next morning, I tried to call the landlord, but his number was disconnected. When I went to his office, it was empty, just an old desk and a single chair in a room that smelled of mildew. I asked the building manager about him, but she just gave me a blank look. Landlord? The building's owned by a company. There's no single landlord. I showed her the lease, but she shook her head. Never seen anything like that before. The clay jar, however, seemed to know me better than anyone else. The punishment came 3 days later. I woke up to find deep scratches down my arms, as if something with claws had raked them in my sleep. My reflection in the bathroom mirror was wrong, my eyes darker, my skin pale and sallow. The whispers no longer waited for nightfall. They followed me everywhere, growing louder and more insistent. They weren't just noises anymore, they were words. "Feed it," they said. "Blood for the vessel. Blood to keep it bound." By the time the end of the month rolled around, I was desperate. With trembling hands, I retrieved a kitchen knife and stood before the jar. It seemed to pulse faintly, its cracks glowing with a dull red light. The whispers rose in a crescendo as I pressed the blade to my palm, hissing in pain as blood welled up. I tilted my hand over the jar, the droplets hitting the surface and soaking into the clay. The moment the first drop hit, the whispers stopped. The jar exhaled again, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood. The next morning, I woke to find the scratches gone, my reflection normal. For the first time in weeks, the apartment felt still. But I couldn't shake the knowledge of what I'd done. I started researching the jar, scouring the internet for any mention of it. Eventually, I found an article buried in the depths of an obscure forum. The jar was an artifact, cursed to contain the soul of a malevolent spirit. The only way to keep it bound was through blood offerings. If the offering stopped, the spirit would be unleashed, free to consume the one who had failed to feed it. I tried to move out, but the lease was clear. Breaking it would result in punitive action. I didn't need to imagine what that meant. Now, every month, I cut my hand open and feed the jar. The whispers no longer haunt me, but the dreams haven't stopped. In them, the jar cracks a little more each time, and something inside stirs, waiting. I don't know how much longer I can keep it contained. But if you ever find an apartment listing that seems too good to be true, read the fine print. And if you see a clay jar on the shelf, don't sign the lease. Story number 6. The knocking at 3 a.m. The first time I heard the knock, it was easy to dismiss. I live in a quiet apartment building on the edge of town, the kind of place where the walls are thin and the creaks and groans of old wood are part of the charm, or so I told myself when I signed the lease. The knock came at exactly 3 a.m., sharp and deliberate. 3 raps, evenly spaced, like someone performing a ritual rather than trying to wake a neighbor. At the time, I chalked it up to coincidence. Maybe a drunk tenant fumbling for the wrong door or some kid playing a late-night prank. I pulled myself out of bed, shuffled to the door, and peered through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty, silent save for the hum of the fluorescent light. The air felt colder than it should have, enough to make me shiver. I waited a moment, then double-checked the locks before going back to bed. The knock came again the next night. Same time, same rhythm. This time, I didn't get up. I stared at the ceiling, my pulse quickening as the sound echoed through the stillness of the apartment. By the time I worked up the courage to check, there was no one there. Again. By the third night, I started to notice things were off. My keys weren't where I'd left them. The framed photo of my parents on the bookshelf was lying face down. A glass I'd left in the sink was now sitting on the kitchen counter. Little things, easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. But I was paying attention now. On the 5th night, I stayed up. I told myself it was just to put my mind at ease, to catch the prankster in the act and put an end to the nonsense. I turned off all the lights and sat on the couch, a baseball bat resting against my knee. The apartment was eerily quiet, every creak of the floorboards amplified in the darkness. When the clock on my phone clicked over to 3 o'clock, the knocking came again. 3 sharp raps, echoing through the apartment. My heart was pounding as I crept toward the door, gripping the bat so tightly my knuckles turned white. Through the peephole, the hallway was empty. No shadows, no movement, just the faint flicker of the old fluorescent bulb. But this time, the knocking didn't stop. It came again, louder now, the rhythm shifting into something more erratic, like someone pounding their fists against the door in desperation. I wanted to shout, to tell whoever, or whatever, it was to leave, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I stepped back, my mind racing. Then it stopped. The silence was worse than the knocking. The next morning, the apartment was different. My books had been pulled from the shelves, scattered across the floor like someone had rifled through them in a hurry. The refrigerator door was wide open, its contents spilled out onto the kitchen tiles. And on the living room wall, scrawled in something dark and sticky, were 3 words, "Let me in." I didn't go to work that day. I spent hours scrubbing the wall, the words stubbornly refusing to fade no matter how hard I scrubbed. By the time the sun set, I'd managed to erase most of it, but the faint outline still lingered, mocking me. I called the building manager, but she brushed it off. "Old building," she said. "Weird stuff happens sometimes. Probably just some kid sneaking in. I'll have someone check the cameras." But there weren't any cameras. Not in this part of the building. The next night, I barricaded the door with furniture. The knocking came at 3 a.m. as usual, but this time, it didn't stay at the door. The sound moved, first to the walls, then to the windows, then to the ceiling. It was everywhere, surrounding me, relentless and inescapable. I stayed on the couch, clutching the bat, my eyes darting toward every shadow, every flicker of movement. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. By the time dawn broke, the knocking had stopped, but the apartment was in disarray. The chairs were overturned, the curtains torn, and the words on the wall were back, darker and more pronounced, "Let me in." That's when I started researching the building. It didn't take long to find the story. 10 years ago, a man had been killed right outside my apartment. Stabbed to death in the hallway after a fight with his girlfriend. The police ruled it a botched robbery, but the details were murky. No arrests were ever made, and the case went cold. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises in the weeks after his death, knocking, crying, even screams, but over time, the stories faded. The building changed hands, tenants came and went, and life moved on. Except, apparently, for him. On the 10th night, I decided I wasn't going to open the door. No matter how loud the knocking got, no matter how desperate it sounded, I wasn't going to let it in. I sat in the middle of the living room, surrounded by candles, clutching the bat like it was a lifeline. When the knocking started, it was different. Slower. Softer. Like someone was tapping gently, almost politely. "Please," a voice whispered, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. "Please, let me in." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out. The voice grew louder, angrier. "You have to let me in," it growled. The knocking turned into pounding, the door shaking on its hinges. I thought it would never stop, but then, just as suddenly as it had started, it went silent. That's when I heard it. Behind me. A low, guttural voice, inches from my ear. "You didn't open the door." I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I woke up, the apartment was freezing. The furniture was back in place, the words on the wall gone, and the door to my apartment was wide open, swinging gently on its hinges. I moved out the next day. Left everything behind, furniture, clothes, even the baseball bat. The landlord didn't ask why, and I didn't offer an explanation. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it again. The knocking. Soft at first, then louder. Always at 3 a.m. If you ever hear it, do yourself a favor. Don't open the door. Don't listen. And whatever you do, don't wait for it to find another way in. Story number 7. Whispers from the Vent. When I first moved into the Harrington Arms, I thought it was perfect. A one-bedroom apartment on the 5th floor of a charming old building with just enough wear and tear to give it character. The rent was cheap, the neighbors kept to themselves, and the view of the city from the window almost made me feel like I belonged. I'd spent most of my life drifting between places, never staying long enough to put down roots, but the Harrington Arms felt different, at least at first. The whispers began during my second week. Late at night, when the city quieted down and the apartment hummed with the faint sounds of old pipes and creaking wood, I heard them. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the byproduct of too much coffee and not enough sleep. But the more I listened, the harder it was to ignore. The whispers came from the vent in my bedroom, faint and indistinct, like a distant conversation held just out of earshot. I tried to dismiss it. Old buildings have quirks, I told myself. The vents probably carried noise from other apartments, amplifying conversations from the floors above or below. But even as I rationalized, the whispers grew louder, clearer. They weren't conversations. They were pleas. "Help me," a voice whispered one night, so soft I barely caught it. "Please, someone help me." I couldn't sleep after that. The words played on a loop in my head, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. The next night, I sat in bed with the lights on, staring at the vent. My apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the fridge and the occasional groan of the building settling. And then it came again. "Help me. Please, don't leave me here." The voice was weak, trembling with desperation. It was impossible to tell if it belonged to a man or a woman, but the pain in it was unmistakable. My skin crawled as I got up and moved closer to the vent. I leaned in, pressing my ear against the cold metal. The whispering continued, fragmented and disjointed. "They won't let us out. We're still here." I pulled back, my heart pounding. Whoever was speaking didn't sound like they were coming from another apartment. The voice seemed to come from inside the vent itself. The next day, I bought a recorder. It was a cheap little device I found at the electronics store down the street, the kind reporters used before smartphones made them obsolete. That night, I placed it next to the vent, hit record, and sat back, waiting. The whispers came as they always did, soft and haunting, rising and falling like a macabre symphony. I didn't sleep that night, too afraid of what I'd hear when I played the recording back. When morning finally came, I grabbed the recorder with trembling hands and pressed play. The first few minutes were filled with the ambient sounds of the apartment, the hum of the fridge, the occasional creak of the floorboards. Then, the whispers began. Hearing them again through the recorder made my skin crawl. They were clearer than I remembered, the words more distinct. "Help us," a voice begged. "It's so dark. It's so cold." "We're still here," another whispered, its tone hollow and distant. "He won't let us leave." And then came a sound I hadn't heard before. A low, guttural laugh, so quiet it was almost imperceptible. It sent a shiver down my spine. Whoever, or whatever, was in the vent wasn't alone. I couldn't ignore it anymore. That afternoon, I went to the building manager, a wiry man named Mr. Crenshaw who always smelled faintly of cigars and cheap cologne. I told him about the whispers, the voices. He gave me a long, hard look before shaking his head. "Old buildings make noise," he said, his tone dismissive. "The vents carry sound from all over. You're just hearing your neighbors." I wanted to argue, but something in his expression stopped me. He knew more than he was letting on. I could see it in the way his eyes darted toward the vent in his office, the way his hand trembled as he lit another cigar. But he wasn't going to say anything. Not to me. That night, I decided to investigate. I pried the vent cover off with a screwdriver and shone a flashlight into the duct. The air inside was cold, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my stomach turn. The duct stretched into darkness, its walls coated in dust and grime. As I stared into the void, something caught my eye. About 10 feet in, nestled against the side of the duct, was a small object. I couldn't make out what it was, but the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. I grabbed a coat hanger, straightened it out, and used it to fish the object closer. It was a cassette tape, its plastic casing cracked and stained. I turned it over in my hands, my pulse quickening as I read the label, Victim Number 1. I borrowed an old tape player from a pawn shop the next morning and played the cassette as soon as I got home. The recording was faint, the sound of static and muffled breathing filling the room. And then came the voice. "My name is Amanda," it said, trembling. "If you're hearing this, please help me. I'm trapped. He put me here. He said no one would find me." Her voice broke, replaced by quiet sobs. Then, after a long silence, came the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. Amanda screamed, the sound cutting off abruptly, replaced by static. I found more tapes in the vent, each one labeled with a different number. Victim number 2. Victim number 3. There were at least a dozen, each one telling a similar story. The victims spoke of a man who had lured them to the building, trapping them in the ventilation system like animals. They begged for help, their voices growing weaker with each recording. None of them survived. As I listened to the final tape, the whispers returned, louder than ever. They echoed through the apartment, rising and falling in a cacophony of anguish. "Don't let him find you," one voice pleaded. "He's still here," another whispered. And then, over it all, came the same low, guttural laugh I'd heard before. I tried to leave that night, but the front door wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pulled, it wouldn't open. The whispers grew louder, the air in the apartment turning icy. I ran to the window, but it was sealed shut, the glass too thick to break. The last thing I remember is the vent. Something moved inside it, a shadow stretching toward me as the laughter grew deafening. When I woke up, the apartment was silent. The vent was sealed, the cover bolted into place as if it had never been removed. The tapes were gone, and so was any trace of what I'd found. I left the Harrington Arms that day, leaving everything behind. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. They follow me, growing louder with each passing day, carrying the same desperate plea. Help us. Story number 8. The Vanishing Apartment. The day I moved into 6E at the Ashcroft, I felt like I'd finally made it. It was a dream apartment, high ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a balcony with a view of the river that could take your breath away. The building was sleek and modern, its lobby decorated with polished marble and a concierge who greeted everyone by name. It was the kind of place I never thought I'd afford, but a sudden promotion at work had changed everything. I signed the lease without hesitation. The landlord, a sharp-dressed man named Mr. Harrow, was charming but oddly distant. 6E is one of our finest units, he said, sliding the papers across the table. You're going to love it here. And for the first few weeks, I did. The apartment felt almost too good to be true. Everything about it was perfect, from the sunlight that poured through the windows in the mornings to the way the building seemed to swallow the noise of the city, leaving me in a bubble of tranquility. But even perfect places have their oddities. It started with the mail. My name wasn't listed on the mailbox for 6E. When I asked the concierge about it, he looked confused. We don't have a 6E, he said, flipping through a clipboard. Maybe there's been a mistake? I laughed it off, assuming it was some kind of mix-up. The address on my lease clearly said 6E, and I had the key to prove it. I didn't think about it again until a neighbor, a man from down the hall, gave me the same puzzled look when I introduced myself. 6E, he repeated, frowning. I thought that part of the floor was under construction. A week later, I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My stomach twisted as I pushed it open, half expecting to find someone inside. But everything was exactly as I'd left it. Nothing was missing, nothing out of place. The only thing I noticed was a faint, metallic smell that lingered in the air. I called the building manager, but when I mentioned my apartment number, there was a long pause. 6E, he asked slowly, as though the words didn't make sense. I'm sorry, ma'am, but that's not possible. What do you mean? I snapped, my voice rising. I live here. There was another pause before he said, I'll send someone up to check, and hung up. No one came. The following day, things got worse. I went out to run errands, locking the door behind me as always. When I returned, the hallway looked different. The lights were dimmer, the air colder. My apartment door was gone. In its place was a solid brick wall, its surface rough and unmarked, as though no door had ever existed. I stood there, my pulse hammering in my ears. I ran my hands over the wall, searching for any sign of the doorway, but there was nothing. My apartment had vanished. I stumbled back to the lobby, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush as I tried to explain to the concierge what had happened. But he didn't seem to recognize me. Are you a guest here? He asked, his tone polite but distant. No, I live here, I said, shaking. 6E. He frowned, glancing at his clipboard again. There's no 6E, ma'am. Are you sure you have the right building? I felt the world tilt beneath me. I've been living here for weeks. My things are in that apartment. My name is on the lease. But when I showed him the lease, the words seemed to blur and shift on the page. The address was wrong. The signature wasn't mine. I looked at it, my hands trembling, as the concierge offered me a faint, pitying smile. I think you're mistaken, he said. I didn't know where else to go. I tried calling Mr. Harrow, but the number was disconnected. My coworkers didn't pick up when I called, and even my closest friends acted as though they didn't know who I was. My emails bounced back, my accounts vanished. It was as if I had been erased. I returned to the Ashcroft that night, desperate for answers. The lobby was empty, its once bright lights dim and flickering. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and the marble floors were cracked and dusty. It didn't make sense. Just that morning, the building had been pristine. I made my way to the 6th floor, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The hallway was darker than before, the walls stained and peeling. I stopped in front of the brick wall where my apartment door should have been, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. Then I heard it, a faint sound coming from behind the wall. It was muffled, like someone crying. Hello? I called, pressing my ear against the bricks. The crying grew louder, turning into desperate sobs. I stepped back, my heart racing. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. There was no response, just the sound of the crying, echoing like it was coming from far away. I don't know why I did it, but I started clawing at the wall, my nails scraping against the rough surface until my fingers bled. The bricks crumbled more easily than they should have, revealing a dark, narrow passage beyond. The passage was cold, the air thick with a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. The walls were lined with doors, each one slightly ajar, their dark interiors yawning like open mouths. Faint whispers drifted through the air, indistinct and overlapping, like the murmurs of a crowd just out of sight. I moved deeper into the passage, my steps hesitant. One of the doors caught my eye. It was the same color as my apartment door, the number 6E etched into its surface. My hand shook as I pushed it open. The room beyond was an exact replica of my apartment, down to the smallest detail. My furniture, my books, my clothes, everything was there. But the air was heavy, the shadows deeper. And in the corner of the room, hunched and trembling, was me. She looked up as I stepped inside, her face pale and tear-streaked. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her voice a hollow echo of my own. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "Who are you?" She didn't answer. Her eyes flicked toward the doorway, and when I turned, I saw it. A figure stood in the shadows, tall and featureless, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. "You need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "It's too late for me, but you can still get out." The figure moved closer, its footsteps silent. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder with each passing second. I turned and ran, the sound of whispers rising to a deafening roar as I stumbled back into the hallway. I don't remember how I got out of the building. When I looked back, the Ashcroft was gone, replaced by an empty lot overgrown with weeds. The city seemed quieter, darker, as though something had shifted. No one remembers the Ashcroft now. When I try to talk about it, people look at me like I'm crazy. My name isn't on any lease, my belongings are gone, and the life I had before moving into 6E feels like a distant dream. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again. They come from the corners of my room, faint and desperate, calling me back to the place I barely escaped. If you ever find yourself drawn to a place that seems too perfect, too good to be true, trust your instincts. Because once you step inside, it may never let you leave.